Welcome, 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 welcome to the Convos with Anita Santiago podcast. I am your host, Anita Santiago. Please like, share, subscribe, and review to the podcast on all major platforms, including Apple and Spotify and Amazon Music. Appreciate the support that the listeners always give. Don't forget to pop over to the website, Life Convos, LIFECONVOS.com, to check out what's new and get some perspective on what you can expect on the podcast. And also, if you ever want to reach out to me directly about topics or you have a suggestion for the show, you can always email me at convos, CONVOS, CWS at gmail.com. Thanks to all the listeners, fans, and supporters for coming by today to check out this episode. We are moving into the holiday season, and this is really a hard time for people who are grieving. So our topic today is grieving through the holiday seasons. Now, when we talk about grief, a lot of times we think in terms of losing someone to a death. But there's a lot of different types of grief that people can have during the holiday season. And I think sometimes we may not consider that. Grieving a marriage or a relationship, a romantic relationship, grieving a friendship that's ended. Maybe you've lost a job, been laid off right before the holiday season. There are many things that people grieve. It's not just losing a loved one, but losing a loved one is probably the most common experience that people share. So I wanted to share this topic in two parts. The first part is for family and friends of people who are grieving. And the second part is for those who are grieving. You know, how do we get through these terrible, tough times? When the holidays come around, often it is a reminder of past happiness and relationships and experiences with people or jobs or other things in our lives that made us happy, and we don't have those things anymore, and they can cause us to grieve. For people who are grieving, it's very important that the family members and the friends that surround that person can support them in a way that's meaningful to them. Often we hear about stages of grief, which I'm not a big fan of that model. I know it's out there. Sometimes people believe that grief is only for a short time and then somehow you pick up and move on. That's not necessarily true. As a therapist that started out in trauma, I can tell you that grief looks very different, and it's a very individualized experience. Grief for some people is not a long process, and for others it's lifelong. I think the misconception that we have is that somehow we all grieve the same and we move through that grief the same. And if you even want to add another piece of this picture of grief, cultural influences have a big impact on how people grieve. And in some cultures, grief is not, people don't grieve the same way. Sometimes it's more of a celebration, depending on different parts of the country. Here in the United States, too, sometimes losing a person is not seen as a sad thing, but a celebration. That being said, it still doesn't take away the loss or the missing of the person if that's what you're grieving. If you're grieving a loved one, even though you have a celebration of life and even though you celebrate them, that doesn't take away the sadness that we can often experience when we are grieving. So to the friends and family members of people who are grieving, here are some ways that you may be able to support someone you love that's meaningful for them. not telling them how to grieve or what they should and shouldn't do, but things that actually make a difference. One of the biggest things is being present and listening. Sometimes people just want to tell the story of their loved ones, why that person mattered, why that person was important. What if it's a pet? People grieve pets deeply. And while the family and friends of that person may not really understand the emotional attachment, being present and listening to that person tell the story of why this relationship in their lives meant so much to them. Just listen. You don't have to say, well, it's been a year, it's been 2 years. Why are you still talking about that person that you lost? And for parents or spouses that have lost the other person, like you're a parent, you've lost a child, or your spouse that lost a spouse, that grief might be lifelong. And that person who's grieving wants to share and talk about that relationship and talk about those things. So as a family member or friend, we can just listen and we can try to understand their feelings. We may not be able to relate necessarily, but we can show that we understand and that we're present and that their feelings are valid. We shouldn't try to minimize the feelings that they're having around that situation. When I first started working in trauma, I read a really interesting book, and it talked about the history of how we mourn death in the United States, and it was from a historical perspective. African American traditions around mourning and Caucasian American traditions around mourning. And one of the things that I found very fascinating was that way back in the day, people typically had 90 days or more to mourn, and they wore black and they walked around, and other people would know that they're in mourning because of the colors that they were wearing. And that gave an opportunity for that person who was mourning to tell the story about their loved one, who it was, how they lost them, and what that relationship meant to them. I feel like nowadays, once the services are over, people are discouraged from really talking about their loved ones, sharing memories, and things of that nature. We should allow people to honor their loved ones, whatever that looks like. For some people, it may be having um, a room or a dedicated space in their home, in addition to telling stories, in addition to sharing and talking about them. That's really a very healthy thing to do. And if you know someone who's mourning, and you can do that, you can give them space to honor their loved ones. That's very, very helpful. And it doesn't have to be strange or weird. If we're listening actively and attentively and being present, then we're allowing that person to share as much of their story as they feel comfortable with. Part of this process is having the patience and the understanding, because sometimes, depending on how that person is grieving, they may like to talk about their loved one a lot, or their pet, or their job that they had, or the place that they used to live. And so having a little understanding and patience as you allow people to tell their story and honor their loved one goes a very long way. Another helpful thing that you might be able to do as a family or a family member or friend is offer emotional support, a check-in. Hey, I was just checking on you today, just seeing how things are going. And when they're telling you they're having a really tough time, they're feeling really down, they don't want to get out of bed, just continue to encourage them. We can't push people to come out of their grief or to move into a different space before they're ready. And often when people are expressing their grief, they're crying or they're talking about their loved one, for the other person who may not be grieving at the moment, it can be uncomfortable. And so the reaction is usually to have the person to stop. Well, here's some Kleenex, dry your eyes, you're going to be okay. This too shall pass. And all the cliches that we often offer when we're wanting people to feel better, but we really don't know what to do. Grief is a response to something that a person cared deeply about. When it comes to loved ones, I typically say that grief is love that has nowhere to go. And that's why it's hard, because the grief is coming from this place of love that the person had for the pet or the person or the relationship that they lost. And so in that sense, we don't have to discourage people from showing emotion and expressing their emotion. We need to create a safe space so that they can feel safe enough to let it out. And that's very, very important in the grieving process. And around the holidays, where there's songs and smells and um, memories, many memories, people can find themselves, even if they did well all year, when the holidays come, it can be very, very tough. So checking in, maybe a text or a phone call, send an encouraging quote or something. Just being there for that person emotionally. Now, there are times where grief is very debilitating, and it may be helpful for people to seek out therapy. Not always, but sometimes. And as a therapist, I always encourage that. But if you're in a situation where you notice that your person is grieving to the point where it's really impacting them, now they can't go to work, they can't go to school, they really can't function well, maybe a suggestion of talking to someone to help them through a really tough time. And if you're a person that struggles through the holidays and it's really, really hard, maybe a little therapeutic support is helpful or could be helpful to you. There are things like employee assistance programs where there may be therapy offered at no cost. There are a lot of organizations that provide therapy at low or no cost, so the cost doesn't have to be a barrier. So again, offering emotional support, it can be very, very helpful to those around us. And please, let's not tell people to get over it. When I worked with homicide moms, there would be moms that have been grieving for 5 or 6 years. And I will tell you, there is, whether a person loses a child by gun violence or illness or accident, there is nothing more gut-wrenching than a parent who longs for a child that is no longer here. And we have to be very careful that we don't try to push people out of the space of grieving, that we give people time and allow them for however long it takes to walk through that process. Like I said, grieving is a very individualized experience. We don't all grieve the same way. We don't all have the same time frame. And maybe you were very resilient when you got through your loss, but you have to understand that other people may not be able to process it like you did. So while I don't think people really intentionally mean harm, we have to be very aware of what we're saying in those moments so that we don't discourage that person from feeling and walking through that process. If you are a person that's grieving, first of all, sending you big hugs and love, because the holiday seasons can be really, really tough. And sometimes, depending on the person, the individual, you may not feel comfortable allowing people into your space. You may not be at a point where you can really share your grief and put your emotions into words. And I find that when people are grieving, that is the challenge. It's hard to put the emotions into words. But there are some things that you can do that may help you get through the holiday season a little better. You may still cry, you may still feel down, but giving yourself space and being kind to yourself during a grieving period can really make the difference in being able to get through it. So what I'm saying is that you might not necessarily feel a ton better, but you'll be able to navigate your way through a very tough situation. So how can you do that if you're the person that's grieving? Allow yourself to feel what you feel. Cry, um, express your feelings. Don't try to ignore them. One of the biggest pieces of the grieving process is allowing yourself to feel what you feel. And sometimes it can be very, very intense, but that's okay. You just want to acknowledge that your love or your love for that person, if it's a person you're grieving, or that pet, your attachment to a situation such as a job, you're allowing yourself to say, this hurt me and I'm sad about it and I don't like it. And when you allow yourself to feel those emotions, all of a sudden it becomes a little bit reasonable to understand that there's a reason behind your sadness. And so you can allow yourself to cry and you can allow yourself to have those emotions without cutting them off and saying, well, I really should be stronger. Who says? Who says so? Acknowledging what you're feeling is the biggest part. And for men, this can be hard because, like in our society, men are encouraged not to show emotion. So how do men grieve? And I think it's very important for men to understand that it's okay to allow yourself to feel what you feel, no matter what society says about men showing emotions. Cry, um, have downtime, whatever it takes, but allowing yourself to feel those emotions and getting comfortable with feeling them and giving them a name. I feel sad. I feel frustrated. I feel discouraged. I never thought this would happen. It's okay to say those things. Another big piece of getting through the holidays if you're grieving is really doing some self-care, taking care of yourself in every way possible, getting enough sleep, making sure that you're eating the types of food that you like. Go for a walk, sit outside, get some sunshine, do things that that normally make you feel good, and signal to you that you're taking care of yourself. That might be picking up a new hobby or getting back to an old hobby, challenging yourself, doing puzzles or whatever the case may be. But when you do those things, when you care for yourself in that way, even though you may feel down emotionally, you're taking care of yourself physically, and that helps you move through the days. Again, the grief process is very hard, and it can be tough depending on what that looks like for you. But if you're taking care of yourself physically, even though you're not feeling the best when it comes to your grief, it will be a little less challenging. Surround yourself with people who support you. So on the one hand, we said for the family and friends of people who are grieving, for them to listen attentively and provide emotional support. For the person who is grieving, being around people that care about you, that have your best interest at heart, that might let you just crash out on the couch and watch TV and just spend time talking and hanging out. Um, Again, this goes to just knowing that you're not alone, knowing that you're supported, knowing that other people care, even if they're not able to really help you with what you're feeling. These things together, allowing yourself to feel the emotion, taking care of yourself physically, spending time with loved ones, all of these things together help support you as you move through a very difficult time. And one of the most creative things that you can do, if you're a person that's grieving, is create new traditions around the holidays. So, for example, if you're grieving a grandmother that you were very close to and you spent a lot of time with, and you always went over to her house for the holidays, maybe now it's time to create a new tradition with different family members or different friends. Um, there are really, really creative ways to do that. But the point of it is to make new memories, to signal to yourself, this is a new time and you've moved into a new space. And now you have new traditions that can help you understand that this is a new place. So, for example, maybe you and your family members take a trip every year instead of going to someone's house. Maybe, like an example I gave previously, you go to a different person's house. Those are just ideas, that you can use to create new traditions. Maybe you get together with friends and you make handcrafted things that you give away, or maybe you volunteer to feed the homeless, or maybe you do a special event. You go to a special football game or a special sports game around this time of the year. It doesn't really matter what you pick, just as long as it's fun and you're creating a new tradition around it. And those are just some of the ideas that I have, that if you're grieving, how to get through this time. Because realistically, you're going to feel sad and you're going to feel down. So I don't want to make it sound like, well, if you do all these things, you won't feel the hurt and the pain of that loss. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that you're going to feel it, but you can feel it and move through it, which is the goal, is to move through it. You might not be at a point where you can enjoy the holidays yet, and that's okay. Just do the best you can. You have to take the time to really understand that this is a process for you. So my challenge to everyone is to be aware of the people in your circle and tune in if you know someone is grieving, if you know someone has been struggling with loss for a very long time, or someone has had a recent loss. Be sensitive to that and see if you can be a person that's supportive. You as an individual family member or friend are not required to give all of the support, but give the support that you can give. Do the things that you know that you're good at. And that will help that person tremendously. And if you're a person that's grieving and you can let people around you know that you need help and you need support, make sure you say something so that those people that really care about you can step in and give you the kind of support that you're looking for and that you need. So that's my challenge to you. The holiday season is about to be in full swing, and let's try to support those people around us that are struggling. Thanks so much for coming by the Convos with Anita Santiago podcast. Like, subscribe, review, and share on all podcast platforms. And make sure that you pop over to the website, lifeconvos.com. And I look forward to seeing you the next time. Happy listening.